And then to wrap up this lecture, let's look at a detailed example that clearly shows the difference between traditional absorption costing and activity-based costing. Okay, so we've just looked at small examples now, illustrated examples, but here's a full-blown type of question that you guys could expect. Wellington Pty Limited manufactures two kinds of shoes, running shoes and hiking boots. Okay, so we've got two different products, running shoes and hiking boots. And they use an automated manufacturing process. They budget to manufacture and sell 75,000 pairs of running shoes and 55,000 pairs of hiking boots. And running shoes are manufactured in batches of 1,000 pairs, while hiking boots are manufactured in batches of 500 pairs. So guys, while we're reading through the information, I just want to do calculations along the way so that we make sense of everything. Already, if we go to our calculations, it's possible to calculate the number of batches because we know that they budget to manufacture and sell 75,000 running shoes and 55,000 hiking boots. Running shoes are made in batches of 1,000 pairs and hiking boots are made in batches of 500 pairs. So using that information, let's just calculate the number of batches. So that's my first calculation I'm going to do. My running shoes are made in batches of 1,000 units, which means it will be 75 batches. And my hiking boots in batches of 500 units, which means it will be 110 batches. So this gives the company a total of 185 batches for the year. Okay, so that's all I've worked out here, is the total batches for the year. If we continue reading and continue doing calculations as we read. Currently, they're allocating all of their manufacturing overheads to products according to machine hours. So currently, they're using traditional costing where they allocate everything using machine hours. Then we are told it takes them 4 machine hours to make a batch of running shoes, and it takes 6 machine hours to make a batch of hiking boots. So using that information, guys, I have already calculated the number of batches. So because I know the number of batches, I can use that to now work out my total machine hours. So for the running shoes, it's 4 hours per batch, and for the hiking boots, it is 6 hours per batch. And we can use that to calculate the total machine hours for the year. Okay, so we said for running shoes, 4 hours per batch, 75 batches. For hiking boots, 6 hours per batch, and we are dealing with 110 batches, which gives me a total of 960 machine hours for the year. If we still keep reading, the budgeted fixed manufacturing overhead for the year is 17.4 million. So you've been given the budgeted cost for the entire year. So what's very important is we already know they're currently using traditional costing, and currently they are allocating this cost based on machine hours. So in order to work out our allocation rate, remember we take the budgeted overhead for the year and we divide by normal capacity, and in this case they want us to use machine hours. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take this budgeted cost for the year, 17.4 million, and I'm going to divide by my machine hours to get a rate per machine hour. And that's if I'm using traditional costing. Then we've been told that the management accountant of Wellington Pty Limited is investigating alternative ways of allocating the fixed manufacturing overheads to products. Okay, so she is looking at alternative ways of allocating the fixed manufacturing overheads. Okay, so potentially from using traditional costing to now using activity-based costing. And what she's now done is she has analyzed the budgeted fixed manufacturing overheads, and she's found the following. So now she isn't just looking at this cost in total, a total of 17.4 million. She's broken the cost down, and she thinks that 10% of the cost relates to material purchase and storage. 25% relates to setting up machines, 55% of the cost relates to production, and 10% of the cost relates to maintenance, okay, routine inspection of the machines. She has also even gone so far as to identify cost drivers. So she's looking at possibly now changing from using traditional costing to using activity-based costing. And she believes that material purchase and storage, an appropriate cost driver is the number of orders placed. So she says we have 75 orders for the running shoes and 50 orders for the hiking boots per year. So again, guys, we can already do a calculation over here. We can already calculate the total number of orders. So for the number of orders, 75 orders of running shoes and 50 orders of hiking boots, giving us a total of 125 orders for the year. She believes that the setting up of machines should be based on setup hours. And she tells us that setups are done for every batch, and each setup takes 24 minutes for running shoes and 15 minutes for hiking boots. Okay, so be careful, setups are not done for each unit. Setups are done for every batch, and then they tell us how long it takes. So she doesn't want the setup cost to be allocated based on the number of setups. She wants the setup cost to be based on setup hours. So we need to work out the total number of setup hours. So setups are done for every batch. So we know already the number of batches. We have 75 batches for running shoes, and we have 110 batches for hiking boots. And we do a setup for every batch. So that gives me the number of setups. If I do a setup for each batch, that means for the running shoes, I will have 75 setups, and for the hiking boots, I will have 110 setups because I have a setup for every batch, okay? However, she does not want me to allocate this cost using the number of setups. She wants me to use setup hours. So she tells me it takes 24 minutes for a batch of running shoes and 15 minutes for hiking boots. So I can easily work out the number of hours. 24 minutes for running shoes, so 24 divided by 60, because I want this in hours, not in minutes. If you don't divide by 60, you're going to get an answer in minutes. So divide by 60 so that you get an answer in hours. She is very clear she wants us to use setup hours as a cost driver. And for hiking boots, it takes them 15 minutes. And again, divided by 60 so that you can get your answer in hours, not in minutes. So then we can work out the number of setup hours. Then for production, that's based on machine hours. We have already calculated the total number of machine hours for the year, so that calculation is already done. And for maintenance, we are going to use inspection hours. And now you need to be careful. We are told that an inspection is done after every 10 hours of machine time, and it takes 12 minutes for running shoes and 36 minutes for hiking boots. But again, we want inspection hours. Okay, so look at this one step at a time. First, all I want you to do is I want you to see that an inspection is done after 10 hours of machine time. That is when we do an inspection. So we need to take our machine hours that we've calculated in calculation 2, and we need to divide that by 10 so that we can get the number of inspections. Because we are told an inspection is done for every 10 machine hours. So if I have 300 machine hours for running shoes, that means I do an inspection every 10 hours, it's going to be 30 inspections. If I have 660 machine hours for hiking boots and I do an inspection every 10 hours, it means I'm going to have 66 inspections. I've calculated the number of inspections. She doesn't want me to use the number of inspections as a cost driver. She wants me to use inspection hours as a cost driver. So now that I know the number of inspections, she says it takes 12 minutes for running shoes and 36 minutes for hiking boots. So I can then convert the number of inspections into inspection hours by just saying times 12 over 60 and times 36 over 60. Why am I dividing by 60? Because I want my answer in hours and not in minutes. Okay, so first makes sense. As we read through the information now, we did a couple of calculations as we read through the information. We calculated the number of batches, the total number of machine hours, the total number of orders, the total number of setup hours, and the total number of inspection hours. I've already done all of those calculations, which is just going to help me just now. Now what we need to do in our required, we need to calculate the budgeted fixed overhead cost per pair of shoes. So we want the budgeted cost per unit for running shoes and for hiking boots. Firstly, if the company uses traditional costing based on machine hours, and secondly, if the company uses activity-based costing. Okay, so let's first just look at traditional costing. Very simple, we've got most of the information already. Remember guys, with traditional costing, we calculate one single rate. It is arbitrary and it is volume-based. So one rate, I don't analyze what this overhead cost for the year is made up of. I just take this total overhead cost for the year. I don't analyze what it's made up of. I don't break it down. I work out one single rate. I don't look for cost drivers. I'm just going to use machine hours. It's arbitrary. I just use machine hours. And machine hours is a volume-based measure that I'm using. So if we look at our calculation, I always want you to split your calculation into two steps. First, you are always going to calculate the allocation rate, and second, you are then going to allocate the cost. So to calculate the rate, this is just revision of everything that we've done. We take the total budgeted cost for the entire year and we divide by normal capacity, and in this question, they've specifically told us to use machine hours. So I don't analyze what the cost is made up of, take the total cost for the year. Be careful, don't divide by machine hours per unit or do something silly like that. You need to divide by the total machine hours for the entire year. So we calculated that in calculation 2. Divide by your machine hours for the year and get your allocation rate. One single allocation rate for the company as a whole. After I know what my rate is, then all I do is I take this rate and I split it between, or I split the cost between my two different products. How many machine hours was for running shoes? 300 machine hours for running shoes, 660 machine hours for hiking boots. So multiply that out. 300 for running shoes, 660 for hiking boots. And you can see what I've done is I've taken my total overhead cost for the entire year and I have apportioned it between the two different products using machine hours as the basis. All right, you can also see because the hiking boots had more machine hours, they are obviously allocated more of the cost. That is a limitation with traditional costing. More machine hours, therefore allocated more of the cost. Less machine hours for running shoes, allocated less of the cost. And then just make sure you always answer the required. So the required specifically wanted the cost per unit. So you take the total cost, you divide by the number of units, and you get a cost per unit. Make sure you actually answer the required. So that's traditional costing. Very, very simple. Now we're going to do the same thing with activity-based costing, but I want you guys to see we're doing the same steps. First, instead of just calculating one allocation rate, we are going to now calculate many activity rates. Many activity rates. It's not arbitrary. We are now going to look for a cause and effect relationship. And further to that, we don't only use volume-based measures, we use volume and non-volume-based measures. But we follow the same steps, guys. First, in step 1, we calculate the activity rate. Exactly the same as I did for traditional costing. The only difference is I won't have a single rate, I'm now going to have many rates. In step 2, I allocate the cost. Exactly the same as what I did with traditional costing. So please, you follow the same approach. Instead now, with activity-based costing, I don't just look at my total overhead cost. I now analyze what the cost is made up of. And this is very easy because all of the information was given in the question. We were told that 10% of the total cost relates to material purchase and storage, 25% relates to setting up of machines, 55% relates to production, and 10% relates to maintenance. So it's easy enough to work out what the split of that cost is. And I want you guys to set your answer out in this table. You must use exactly the same table. So first we discuss what the cost is, then we list what the annual cost is. Then we discuss the cost driver. And that was very easy because you were given the cost drivers, guys. Very simple. You won't always be given the cost drivers, so you must be able to identify cost drivers, but it will be easy enough for you guys to be able to identify the cost drivers. So for example, in this question, we were told that for material purchase and storage, we must use the number of orders. For setting up of machines, we must use setup hours. For production, we must use machine hours, and for maintenance, we must use inspection hours. So they told you what to use as a cost driver. Okay, and you can see it makes sense. There's a relationship between the cost and what we are using as the cost driver. So we use the number of orders, setup hours, machine hours, and inspection hours. And the lucky thing is, guys, you have already done all of these calculations. As we read through the question, I said to you, let's do these calculations. So we already did work out the total number of orders, the total setup hours, the total machine hours, and the total inspection hours. And what I want you to be aware of when you are calculating this activity rate over here, you are just taking the annual cost and you are dividing by the annual cost driver volume. And you need to be consistent. If this is the total cost for the entire year, the annual cost, this must be the total number of orders for the entire year. If this is the setup cost for the whole year, this must be the total number of setup hours for the whole year. Okay, you're being consistent the entire time. So all of these calculations that we did up here, this was the number of batches for the entire year, the number of machine hours for the entire year, the number of orders for the entire year, the number of setup hours for the year, and the number of inspection hours for the entire year. You're being consistent. And you can see we're doing exactly the same thing that we did with traditional costing. We take the cost and we divide by our cost driver. But now we're not just doing the calculation once, we're doing the calculation 4 times. We take the cost, we divide by the cost driver, and we get a rate per order. The cost divided by the cost driver, get a rate per setup hour. The cost divided by the total machine hours, get a rate per machine hour. The cost divided by the number of inspection hours, get a rate per inspection hour. You're doing exactly the same thing. You just don't have 1 rate, you now have 4 rates. Otherwise, it's exactly the same thing. Then we do the same thing again. Now that we know what these activity rates are, we take the activity rates and we apportion or we allocate the cost between the different products. So we know that the cost per order is 13,920. We know that running shoes has 75 orders and boots has 50 orders from above over here. And we apportion the cost between the different products. And we do the same thing. Take the rate per setup hour, and we are going to multiply it by the number of setup hours for running shoes and for hiking boots. Can you see what I'm doing? For production, we take this rate that we have over here, and that's a rate per machine hour. So we're going to multiply it by 300 machine hours for the running shoes and by 616 machine hours for the hiking boots. Easy, hey? Easy, easy. Get your rate per inspection hour. and we're going to multiply it out by the number of inspection hours. So always just go back to your calculations. 6 inspection hours, 39.6. 39.6. And all you've done, guys, is you've taken the total overhead cost. What was that cost in total? 17.4 million. And you can see you've split it between the two different products. But now, just instead of splitting it using machine hours, we've actually looked at appropriate cost drivers, and it's a much more accurate split. All right. And then again, just make sure you answer the required. The required specifically wants the cost per unit or the cost per pair. So you need to divide by the number of units so that you get your cost per pair. Okay. Then what's an important thing that I just want you to take note of, and it links back to what I just said here. This total, if we add together these two costs, we come back to the total. And that's because in this question, this company only has two products. We are dealing with, what is this company? This company is Wellington Pty Limited, and they make two different products. So it makes sense, if this is their total overhead cost for the year, when we are splitting it between the two different products, it must tie back to the total. So in my case, or in this example, you guys can see when I've split the cost over here between the two products, it ties back to the total. It won't necessarily always happen like that, because sometimes what will happen is we are only dealing with selected products of the company and not all of the products. So you might have a question where the company maybe has 10 products, but we are actually only looking at 2 of the 10 products. And if we only look at 2 of the 10 products, obviously the total cost over here isn't going to tie back to the total cost for 10 products, because we're only analyzing 2 of their 10 products that they have. All right, then let's make sure we can discuss this. There's a reason why, guys, when I do the lecture with you, I don't just jump into the number crunch calculation. The number crunch calculation isn't difficult, but you do need to understand the logic and the reasoning behind the calculation, because at this level, UNISA does not only expect you to do a calculation, but you obviously need to be able to analyze the calculation that you've done. So if we look at the discussion, we saw that when we used traditional costing, we allocated more overhead costs to the hiking boots. And that's because we were using machine hours as a basis to do the calculation, and hiking boots required more machine hours. So because the hiking boots used more machine hours, we can see the unit cost over there is a lot higher with traditional costing. Okay, so what actually ended up happening with traditional costing is the hiking boots were overcosted because they had more machine hours, and the running shoes ended up being undercosted. We didn't have a cause and effect relationship. We just used machine hours as the basis. We didn't look at a cause and effect relationship between the cost and the cost driver. So this was a lot less accurate when we were costing our products. However, when we did the calculation using activity-based costing, we ensured that the product which caused the cost was allocated more of the cost. So we needed to look at that in a bit more detail over here. When it came to material purchase and storage, the product that required more orders was allocated more of the ordering cost. For the setup of the machines, the one with more setup hours was allocated more of the cost. For production, the one with more machine hours was allocated more of the cost. And for maintenance, the one with more inspection hours was allocated more of the cost. So the product that actually causes the cost to occur is being allocated more of the cost. So obviously that results in a lot more superior costing of our products. So make sure you can also discuss. Now, one other thing that I just want to emphasize to you guys before we wrap up this lecture is sometimes you cannot calculate an activity rate. Now, I have said to you, always break your calculation down into 2 steps. Okay, let's clean this up so we can just make sure you're 100% happy with this. I've said to you in step 1, calculate your activity rate, and then in step 2, you allocate the cost between the two products. But what you might find is you might have a situation where it's not possible to calculate the activity rate. So for example, we know that the maintenance cost is 1,740,000 Rand. Let's say we do not know the number of inspection hours. They don't tell us the number of inspection hours. It's not possible to calculate the number of inspection hours. If we don't know the inspection hours, we obviously won't be able to calculate the rate per inspection hour. Okay, so you can only do this, you can only calculate the allocation rate if there is enough information. Now, in most questions, there is enough information. If there's enough information, you take your cost, you divide by your cost driver volume, and you calculate an activity rate. If you can't work out your cost driver volume, then it's impossible to calculate an activity rate. And in that case, you can't split your calculation into 2 steps. Instead, you're going to have to go directly onto step 2, and you're going to have to split the cost. How are you going to do that? Well, they'll have to give you some other information. For example, what they might do is they might just tell you that the cost should be split 60% running shoes and 40% hiking boots. So they tell us in the question that our maintenance cost is 1,740,000. We are not given the number of inspection hours, or it is not possible for us to calculate the inspection hours. So because of that, we cannot calculate an activity rate because we don't know the number of inspection hours. But they need to give me something. So instead, what do? They tell me that the cost should be split 60% running shoes and 40% hiking boots. Then obviously, guys, you're just going to take the cost and you're going to split it 60-40 between the running shoes and the hiking boots. You can't calculate an allocation rate first. You need to go directly onto step 2 of the calculation, where you just allocate the cost. So don't stress if you don't have enough information and it's not possible to work out the rate. Don't worry about working out the rate. Jump directly into step 2 and just apportion the cost between the 2 different products. And that ties back obviously to my total cost. We've just split the cost between the 2 using the information provided. So read the question. If you can calculate an activity rate, first calculate the activity rate, then apportion it between the 2 products. If you can't calculate an activity rate, you can directly go into step 2 and just apportion the cost between the 2 different products. All right, so that brings us to the end of our activity-based costing lecture. Thank you, guys.